The morning was calm, the kind of morning when the world seemed to move at its own slow pace. The little cafe at the corner of the street was already filled with people. Some were students rushing to finish their notes before class, others were office workers grabbing their coffee before heading to their desks, and a few sat quietly reading newspapers. The cafe smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, the kind of smell that made anyone want to stay just a little longer. In the middle of this busy scene, a little girl walked in with her mother. She was small, fragile-looking, and wore a warm knitted cap even though the weather was not very cold. Her mother held her hand tightly, guiding her gently through the crowd. The girl's steps were light, almost careful, as if she carried an invisible weight. Anyone who looked closely could see she was sick, though her eyes sparkled with curiosity, the way only children's eyes do. Every table seemed to be taken, and her mother looked around anxiously, trying to find a place for them to sit. The girl looked around too, her eyes scanning every corner. That was when she saw him, a man sitting alone at a table near the window. He looked different from the rest of the crowd. While most people were chatting or busy with their phones, he sat in silence, a cup of coffee untouched before him. He wore a dark suit, neat and simple, yet there was something about him that made him stand out. The girl tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the table. Her mother hesitated for a moment, then nodded softly, giving her permission. The girl let go of her mother's hand and walked slowly to the man. She stopped beside him, looked up at his face, and asked in the sweetest, softest voice, "Can I sit here?" The man looked down, surprised. For a moment, he didn't answer. He was used to silence, used to keeping people at a distance. But the innocence in her voice, the courage it took for a small, sick child to ask a stranger for a seat, touched something inside him. Without a word, he gave a gentle nod. The girl smiled, the kind of smile that could melt even the coldest of hearts, and climbed onto the chair across from him. She placed her small hands on the table, looking around with wide eyes. Her mother soon joined, sitting quietly beside her, grateful that someone had offered them space. The man glanced at the girl now and then. She seemed too young to carry such tiredness in her eyes, yet there was a brightness in her that made the room feel warmer. He noticed how she looked at the coffee machine with fascination, how she tapped her fingers on the table in rhythm, as if making her own music. She was full of life, even though her weak body tried to hide it. For a while, no words were spoken. The cafe buzzed with voices and laughter, but their table stayed quiet. Then, the little girl leaned forward and said softly, "You look sad." The man blinked, not expecting such words from a child. He almost smiled but caught himself. "Do I?" he asked gently. "Yes," she replied, nodding with certainty. "Your eyes are sad. Like you lost something." Her words hit him deeper than she could ever know. Indeed, he had lost something, or rather, someone. His late wife had been the center of his world, and ever since she passed away, silence had been his only companion. Though he was a successful CEO, a man admired in his field, his personal life was empty. The wealth, the respect, the business empire, none of it could fill the space she had left behind. He took a slow breath, looking at the girl. "You are very observant," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl smiled again. "My mom says I notice things. She says it's because I have to spend a lot of time watching people at the hospital." At that, her mother touched her hand, a quiet reminder not to talk too much. But the man's expression softened, encouraging the girl to continue. "What do you do at the hospital?" he asked carefully. "I go there a lot," the girl explained. "I have to take medicine. Sometimes it makes me feel tired, but sometimes I get to read books. I like reading stories. They make me forget the beeping machines." The man listened closely, every word sinking into his heart. This child, with all her struggles, spoke with such honesty and lightness. She did not complain, did not frown. Instead, she found joy in books and the little things around her. He found himself saying, "I used to read to someone too." "Who?" she asked curiously, tilting her head. "My wife," he answered quietly. "She loved stories." The girl looked at him with big eyes, filled with the kind of compassion only a child could have. "Where is she now?" He hesitated, his throat tightening. "She's not here anymore." "I'm sorry," the girl whispered. Her voice was gentle, sincere, without pity, only understanding. For the first time in years, he felt a connection that wasn't built on money, respect, or power. It was simple, pure human connection. A sick little girl, who had every reason to be bitter, showed him kindness in her words. The cafe noise seemed to fade as they spoke. Her mother watched quietly, surprised at how her daughter and the stranger bonded so quickly. The man noticed the way the mother held her handbag tightly, as if it carried the weight of her whole world. He could see the tired lines on her face, the silent worry in her eyes. He had seen similar expressions on his own face once, during his wife's illness. The little girl began to tell him about her favorite stories, about how she liked fairy tales where the hero never gave up. She talked about her dream of one day visiting a big library filled with books, where she could spend hours reading without feeling sick. He listened, really listened, something he hadn't done in years. Her words were not just stories, they were lessons about courage, hope, and finding joy even in hard times. Time passed without him noticing. The coffee before him had gone cold, but he didn't care. For once, his mind was not filled with business meetings, contracts, or company numbers. Instead, it was filled with the voice of a little girl who reminded him that life still had meaning. When her mother finally stood up, thanking him for letting them share the table, the girl looked at him and asked, "Can I see you again?" The man paused. He was not used to such direct, innocent requests. But in that moment, he realized that this small encounter had opened a door he thought was forever closed. With a gentle smile, he said, "Yes. I would like that." The girl grinned, her eyes sparkling like sunlight through a window. She waved goodbye before walking out with her mother, leaving him sitting there, still feeling the warmth of her presence. As he looked at the empty chair across from him, he realized something had shifted inside. For years, he had lived behind walls of grief and work. But today, with just 3 words, "Can I sit here?" a little girl had cracked those walls and reminded him that even in pain, life could offer new beginnings. The next day began just like any other for the man. His office stood tall in the center of the city, a shining glass tower where hundreds of people worked under his leadership. On the outside, he was the image of success: sharp suits, an expensive car, a name that appeared in business magazines. Yet on the inside, his life felt as empty as the cold marble floors of his mansion. But that morning, something felt different. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by files and reports, his mind drifted back to the small cafe. He remembered the little girl's bright eyes, the way she spoke so openly, and her simple question, "Can I see you again?" It echoed in his mind like a gentle knock on a door he hadn't opened in years. Work continued around him: assistants bringing schedules, managers asking for decisions, emails filling his inbox. Yet through it all, her voice lingered. For the first time in a long time, the thought of meetings and profits felt unimportant. What mattered was that tiny spark of warmth he had felt sitting across from her. By late afternoon, he found himself walking back to the cafe. He told no one where he was going, not even his driver. It was unusual for him to appear anywhere without planning, but this time, he followed his heart instead of his schedule. The cafe looked the same, filled with the soft hum of chatter and the smell of baked bread. But the chair she had sat in yesterday was empty. He sat down anyway, ordering a fresh cup of coffee. His eyes kept turning to the door, hoping she might appear again with her mother. Minutes passed. Then, just as he was about to leave, the door opened and she walked in. Her mother guided her gently, carrying a small paper bag in her hand. The girl's face lit up when she spotted him. "You came back," she said with delight, hurrying to his table. He couldn't help but smile. "Yes. I thought maybe I'd see you again." She climbed into the chair, placing the bag on the table. "I brought cookies today. My mom let me help make them last night. They might not look perfect, but they taste good." He took one, breaking it in half and tasting it. It was simple, slightly uneven, but full of care. "Delicious," he said sincerely. The girl giggled, proud of her baking. Her mother sat quietly beside her, watching the scene unfold. She was cautious, unsure of this stranger, but she could see the way her daughter's eyes shone when she talked to him. It was rare for her child to feel so alive outside the hospital walls. The girl began talking again, her words flowing like a little stream. She told him about the books she had been reading, fairy tales where brave knights saved kingdoms, and little stories about animals that talked. She had a way of describing things that made even the simplest tale sound magical. He listened carefully, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just smiling at her excitement. It was strange. People usually spoke to him with respect, hesitation, or fear. But this little girl spoke freely, without any mask, without any care for who he was. To her, he was just a man at a table who listened. At one point, she leaned closer and whispered, "Can I tell you a secret?" He nodded. "Of course. I get scared sometimes," she said softly. "At night, when the hospital lights are too bright and the machines keep making noises, I feel like I'll never get better. But then I think of stories where the hero fights the monster, and I tell myself maybe I can fight too." Her honesty touched him deeply. For a child to speak of such fears so openly, it was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He remembered the long nights when he had sat beside his wife's hospital bed, listening to machines, feeling helpless. He had lost that fight, but hearing this girl's bravery stirred something inside him. "You are already a hero," he told her gently. "Heroes are not people who never get scared. They are the ones who keep going even when they are." She smiled, her little face glowing with pride at his words. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said firmly. Her mother's eyes softened, and for a moment, she too seemed lighter, as if his words had reached her heart as well. As the afternoon faded, the cafe began to empty. The girl was still talking, telling him about her dream to one day have a big shelf full of books, so many that she could read a new one every single day. "I want to live in stories," she said. "Because in stories, anything can happen. Even miracles." The man listened, and deep down, something began to shift. He had built his life on logic, numbers, and careful plans. Yet here was a child teaching him about hope, courage, and miracles. When it was time for them to leave, she reached across the table and touched his hand with her tiny fingers. "Will you come again?" she asked. He looked at her small hand resting on his, and for the first time in years, he felt a warmth that went beyond business or success. "Yes," he promised softly. "I'll come again." Her smile was brighter than the setting sun outside. As she walked out with her mother, clutching the empty cookie bag, he stayed behind for a while, staring at the chair she had left. That night, back in his mansion, he did not feel the usual coldness of the empty rooms. Instead, he thought of her words, her stories, her bravery. He thought of her laughter, her cookies, her gentle voice saying, "You are already a hero." For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt a reason to look forward to tomorrow. Not for meetings, not for money, not for the endless chase of success, but for the smile of a little girl who saw him not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but simply as a man who could be her friend. The world outside his window was quiet, but inside him, something new had begun to grow. A fragile seed of hope, watered by the innocence of a child who had asked the simplest of questions: can I sit here? And without realizing it, he was already waiting for the next time she would. The days that followed seemed different for him. Life still moved with the same speed, business meetings filled his calendar, and responsibilities waited for him at every corner. But now there was something new pulling at his heart. He found himself checking the time often, thinking about when he might see the little girl again. It was unusual for a man like him, someone who had lived behind walls of grief for years, to look forward to something so simple, yet it gave his life a fresh meaning. When he returned to the cafe the next week, he found her sitting at the same table by the window, this time with a book in her hand. She looked up as soon as he entered, her eyes sparkling. "You came," she said with excitement, as if she had been waiting all day just to see him. He smiled, pulling out the chair across from her. "Of course. You asked me to, didn't you?" The girl nodded proudly, holding up the book in her hand. "I brought my favorite story today. Do you want me to read it to you?" He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, and nodded. "I'd like that." Her voice was soft but steady as she read aloud. The story was about a brave little bird who wanted to fly across the sea even though everyone said it was impossible. As she read, her eyes lit up, her small hands turning the pages carefully. He listened intently, not so much to the story itself, but to the way she told it, pouring life into each word. When she finished, she looked at him with expectation. "Do you think the bird really made it across the sea?" He thought for a moment. "Yes. Because the bird believed it could. Sometimes, believing is the first step to doing the impossible." She smiled, satisfied with his answer. "That's what I think too." Her mother watched quietly, noticing how her daughter seemed stronger, more alive, whenever she spoke with this man. It wasn't easy raising a sick child alone. The medical bills, the endless hospital visits, the worry that never left her mind, it had all worn her down. But seeing her daughter smile so brightly gave her hope. After a while, the girl put down her book and looked at him curiously. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," he replied. "Why do you look lonely even when you smile?" she asked gently. Her question caught him off guard. Few people dared to look past his polished image, his expensive suit, his confident voice. But this child, with her innocent eyes, saw right through him. He hesitated, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. Finally, he said softly, "Because I lost someone I loved very much." "Your wife?" she asked, remembering what he had mentioned before. He nodded. "Yes. She was my best friend, my partner in everything. We dreamed of growing old together, but life had other plans. Since she left, I've felt like half of me is missing." The girl tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "I know what it feels like when something is missing," she said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm missing a normal life. Other kids can run, play outside, go to school every day. I can't. I spend too much time with doctors and machines. But I try not to be sad, because being sad doesn't make the days easier." Her words pierced his heart. For years, he had drowned himself in sadness, using work as a shield to hide from his grief. Yet here was a little girl who faced pain every day, yet still found reasons to smile, to dream, to hope. "You're very strong," he told her sincerely. She shook her head. "Not really. Sometimes I cry when no one's looking. But my mom says it's okay to cry. She says crying makes more room for courage inside." He looked at her mother then, and for the first time, their eyes met with unspoken understanding. She gave a small nod, as if to say thank you for listening to her daughter, for giving her something to look forward to. The man turned back to the girl and said softly, "Your mother is right. Crying doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." For a while, They sat in comfortable silence, the cafe sounds filling the air around them. Then the girl leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Can I tell you something else?" "Of course," he said gently. "Sometimes I'm scared that I won't get better," she admitted, her eyes glistening. "But then I think maybe God sent me people to make the hard days easier. Like my mom. And, maybe you too." His throat tightened at her words. He reached across the table and covered her small hand with his large one. "I think maybe you were sent to me as well," he said honestly. "You've reminded me that life still has meaning." She squeezed his hand gently, her smile returning. "Then we'll both help each other not feel so lonely." From that day, their bond deepened. He began visiting her not just at the cafe, but sometimes at the hospital too. He would bring her books, puzzles, or simply sit by her bed and listen to her stories. She called him her story friend, and he called her his little bird. During one visit, he noticed the tired look in her mother's eyes as she spoke with the doctors. Later, he quietly asked the hospital staff about the girl's condition. What he learned broke his heart even more. The treatments were expensive, the family was struggling, and though her mother tried to hide it, the weight was crushing her. That night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights outside his window. He thought about all the money he had, money that could buy cars, houses, vacations, things that no longer brought him joy. And then he thought about the little girl, whose only dream was to read more stories, to live long enough to see miracles. For the first time, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his wealth. Not for recognition, not for business advantage, but to give a child hope, to give her mother relief, to bring light into their lives. He closed his eyes, remembering her words, "We'll both help each other not feel so lonely." And in that moment, he realized that perhaps this was the beginning of his healing too. The bond between the man and the little girl grew stronger with each passing week. What had begun as a simple question in a cafe, "Can I sit here?" was now something much deeper. She was no longer just a stranger's child. She had become a part of his days, a reason for him to look forward to tomorrow. He visited her often at the hospital, sometimes in the evenings after his long business meetings, sometimes early in the morning before work began. Whenever he entered her room, her face lit up, and that glow warmed his heart in ways he could not explain. He would bring her small surprises, a storybook, a puzzle, a little stuffed toy. But the gift she loved most was his time. He listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes, and sometimes just sat quietly beside her, holding her hand when she felt weak. Her mother was always there too, sitting by her bedside with quiet strength. She was polite, but still cautious around him. After all, he was a stranger, a powerful man she knew nothing about. Yet she couldn't ignore the difference he made. Her daughter, who once spent many days in silence, now smiled, laughed, and even ate better when he was around. One evening, as the girl slept, he stepped outside the room and found her mother speaking with the doctor. Her face was pale, her voice trembling. He overheard enough to understand the problem: the medical bills had grown too heavy. Insurance covered only part of the cost, and the treatments were becoming harder to manage. The mother tried to stay strong, but the weight of her worry was written in her tired eyes. Later that night, he sat alone in his office, his desk covered with contracts and financial reports. He had built an empire of wealth, enough to live 10 lifetimes without worry. Yet what was the use of all this money if it could not bring joy, if it could not ease pain? He remembered the girl's tiny hand gripping his, her brave words about not wanting to feel alone. He realized that he had the power to change her story, not just as a listener, but as someone who could act. The next morning, he quietly called the hospital's financial department. Without revealing his identity to the mother, he arranged to cover her medical bills. He instructed them to make it look like a special grant, a fund for patients in need. He wanted no recognition, no thanks. He only wanted to lift the burden from her mother's shoulders. When the mother later learned that the hospital had reduced the bills, she wept quietly in her room, clutching her daughter's hand. She did not know it was him, sitting just outside, watching with a heavy but hopeful heart. The little girl noticed his thoughtful expression when he came inside. "Why do you look like you're thinking so hard?" she asked innocently. He smiled softly. "Because I'm thinking of ways to make sure you get all the stories you want to read." She clapped her hands, delighted. "Then you'll need a lot of books." "Yes," he replied gently. "And you'll need a lot of strength to read them all." From then on, his visits became more frequent. He read to her when she was too tired to read herself. He told her stories about his own life, about the places he had traveled, the people he had met. She loved hearing about the world beyond her hospital walls. Sometimes, he even brought little sketches of places, parks, mountains, rivers, so she could imagine them clearly. One afternoon, as he read to her, she suddenly asked, "Do you ever feel like your heart is heavy?" He paused, closing the book. "Yes. Very often." She looked at him seriously, her small face thoughtful. "Me too. But then I think maybe hearts are like balloons. If you hold them too tight, they feel heavy. But if you let them float, they feel lighter." Her words stunned him. Such wisdom from such a young child. He realized she was teaching him more than he was teaching her. "Then maybe you can teach me how to let my heart float," he said softly. She giggled. "It's easy. Just think of happy things. Like cookies. Or stories. Or friends who don't let you feel alone." That night, he lay awake in his large, empty mansion. He thought of her words, her laughter, her courage. The emptiness that once echoed in those walls didn't feel as sharp. Slowly, the memories of his late wife still hurt, but they no longer felt like chains. Instead, they felt like gentle reminders of love that once was, and maybe, just maybe, of love that could be found again in a different form. As weeks passed, the staff at the hospital began to notice. The little girl seemed more cheerful, more hopeful. Her laughter echoed in the hallways. Nurses smiled when they saw the quiet, dignified man arrive with a bag of books or toys. No one said anything, but they all knew something extraordinary was happening. One evening, the girl asked him, "Do you ever get tired of coming to see me?" He shook his head firmly. "Never. In fact, I look forward to it. You are the best part of my day." Her face lit up, and she whispered, "You're the best part of mine too." Her mother overheard those words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to trust him fully. She approached him later, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know why you've chosen to be here for her, but I need you to know it means more than I can say. You've given her strength, and you've given me hope." He looked at her kindly, his own voice gentle. "She has given me just as much. Maybe even more." It was the truth. The little girl had become a light in his dark world. She reminded him of everything he had lost, yes, but also of everything he could still gain: joy, laughter, human connection. From that day forward, their bond was no longer fragile. It was strong, steady, and undeniable. He was no longer just a man in a suit, no longer just a CEO or a millionaire. To the girl, he was her friend, her story partner, her listener. To her mother, he was a stranger who had become family. And to himself, he was finally someone who felt alive again. He realized that in giving to them his time, his care, his quiet help, he had received something priceless in return. A new chance at life. A chance to heal. A chance to feel love, even if it wasn't the same as before. And all of it began with a sick little girl who had looked up at him in a crowded cafe and asked the simplest of questions, "Can I sit here?" The weeks turned into months, and the bond between the man and the little girl grew into something that neither of them could have imagined on that first day in the cafe. What began as a small act of kindness, a stranger letting a child sit at his table, had become a relationship that changed both their lives. He no longer saw himself as just a man weighed down by grief. Each time he walked into the hospital, carrying books, or flowers, or simply his presence, he felt alive. She had given him something no wealth, no business deal, no achievement could ever bring back, a reason to feel joy again. The little girl grew stronger with his visits. Though she was still sick, the sparkle in her eyes returned. Nurses often whispered to each other how different she seemed whenever he was there. It was as if his presence gave her a kind of courage that medicine alone could not provide. One morning, he surprised her with a gift, a large box filled with books of all kinds. Fairy tales, adventures, picture books, even gentle stories of hope. Her small hands trembled with excitement as she opened it. "This is more than a library," she exclaimed. "It's a whole world." He laughed softly. "Then you can live in all the worlds you want. And I'll be here to listen when you tell me about them." Her mother, standing nearby, wiped away a tear quietly. She knew her daughter's dreams had always been small because of her illness, but now those dreams were being painted in bright colors again. But the girl was wise, far beyond her years. One evening, after he had read to her, she said softly, "You know, you don't look so lonely anymore." He looked at her, surprised by her words. "And how can you tell?" She smiled knowingly. "Because your eyes don't look heavy now. They shine, just a little, when you laugh. That means your heart is floating." He chuckled gently. "Then you've kept your promise. You've taught me how to let my heart float." Their friendship became known among the hospital staff. People respected him for what he did, but he never sought attention. He remained humble, never speaking of his help or his wealth. To him, this wasn't about charity or image, it was about love, the pure kind that comes from caring for someone without expecting anything in return. The girl continued to inspire him with her words. She told him once, "Sometimes when I feel weak, I pretend I'm in a story. The hero never gives up, so I can't either. And heroes don't fight alone. They always have friends." Her words struck him deeply. He realized that while he had come into her life to give her comfort, she had become his hero in return. She had fought battles every day with bravery he could only admire. He began to spend less time drowning in work and more time being present, not just for her, but for himself. He started noticing things he had long ignored: the warmth of the sun, the beauty of a simple walk in the park, the value of sitting quietly without rushing to the next task. Life was no longer just about building companies or growing wealth. Life was about moments, and he was finally living them again. One day, the girl asked him, "Do you ever think your wife would be happy for you?" The question brought a lump to his throat. He had often wondered the same thing, whether his late wife would approve of the way he had hidden from the world. He thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "I think she would be glad that I found a friend like you. She always wanted me to smile more. And you've given me that." The girl smiled softly, reaching for his hand. "Then maybe she sent me to you." He could not speak after that. His eyes burned with tears, but for once, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. As the seasons changed, so did the story of their lives. The hospital staff noticed that with continued care, the little girl was slowly showing signs of improvement. The treatments, now fully supported, gave her strength. Her mother, once weighed down by constant worry, began to smile more freely. And the man, once a widowed CEO who had lived only for work, was no longer just that. He was a friend, a mentor, and in many ways, a father figure to the little girl who had taught him to feel again. On one bright afternoon, the girl was well enough to leave the hospital for a short trip. He took her and her mother to the city library. The moment she walked inside and saw rows upon rows of books, she gasped, her face glowing. "It's even bigger than I imagined," she cried. She ran her fingers over the spines of books, pulling some out, hugging them to her chest. He watched her with a smile that came from deep within his soul. For years, he had walked past this library on his way to work, never once stepping inside. But now, standing here with her, it felt like the most magical place in the world. They spent hours there, reading, laughing, exploring. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like life had given him back something precious, not the same as what he lost, but something new, something just as meaningful. As the sun began to set, the girl leaned against him, tired but happy. "This was the best day ever," she whispered. He placed his arm gently around her. "There will be many more," he promised. The promise was not empty. He knew now that he would be by her side, as long as life allowed. She had changed him, saved him from his loneliness, and reminded him that even broken hearts can heal when touched by kindness. Her mother watched them together, her heart full. She had once feared that her daughter would never know joy again, that illness would steal away all her laughter. But now, seeing her daughter so alive, she knew that miracles came in many forms. Sometimes, a miracle was not a sudden cure. Sometimes, a miracle was a person, a stranger, who became family. That night, as he returned home, he stood by the window of his mansion, looking at the city lights. But unlike the nights before, he did not feel alone. He felt connected to a little girl who had brought him back to life, to a mother who had shown him quiet strength, to the simple truth that love and compassion were the real treasures of life. He whispered softly into the night, as if speaking to his late wife, "I think you'd be proud of me. I've found a reason to live again." And somewhere, deep inside, he felt peace. The story of a sick little girl and a widowed millionaire was not about wealth, or illness, or even loss. It was about connection, about hearts that found each other when they needed it most. She had asked the simplest of questions: "Can I sit here?" And in that moment, she gave him a new life. Their journey was far from over. There would still be hard days, challenges, and tears. But there would also be laughter, stories, hope, and love. And that was enough.